Yes, great to see you all. I am Robby Soave. I'm a senior editor at Reason Magazine and thank you, Spike, and host of a YouTube show.
Already working the refs. That's not fair.
My job here is to keep these two who just really hate each other. They're gonna lay into each other. You know, I'm gonna try my best to keep it civil, but I will likely fail. I am joined today by Spike Cohen, who needs no introduction, vice presidential candidate for the Libertarian ticket last time round, and also Christian Britschgi, my colleague at Reason Magazine, who does wonderful stuff writing about housing and some other issues. Yeah, everybody applaud for our guests. Spike is filling in. You had to do a lot of debates today. Spike is filling in for another Reason person, our editor, Catherine Maggie Ward, who had hurt her knee on the way to the conference, or before she left, rather. So we're having a debate today, Anarchy versus Minarchy. It's going to be fun. Spike is representing the pro-anarchy position. That's what you've been slotted into. Woo, anarchy, yeah. Christian, this cuck over here, is going to just Minarchy. Look at him being embarrassed.
A lot of hearts and minds to win over. I'm looking forward to it.
So without further ado, because we have limited time, Christian, why don't you start and explain why Minarchy is actually the better way to go?
Okay, for sure. So yeah, thank you, Students for Liberty, for putting this on. Spike for stepping in to do this. You're relieving me of the need to argue with my boss in public, so I appreciate that. Yes. So, and I want to make clear, I'm arguing the debate is anarchy versus Minarchy. It's not the anarchist utopia versus the current government that we have now.
That's not up for debate.
Yeah. The second thing is, you know, at this conference, I'm noticing a lot of buttons that say, or buttons and T-shirts, and in one case, a very large yellow top hat that says "taxation is theft." I agree with that. Taxation is theft, right? It's aggression, it's coercion, it's the compulsory taking of your property. But the thing with, I think even Spike would agree here, is that even in Ancapistan, there's still going to be theft, there's still going to be aggression and coercion. It would just, you know, it would happen, you know, people are still going to steal or murder potentially. You know, private parties coerce each other all the time. Even if you get rid of the state, there's still going to be coercion. So the question is, what is the institutional arrangement that leads to the least amount of aggression possible? I would argue that is a minimal state restrained by a liberal constitution with democratically elected officers, you know, with a list of rights that people are guaranteed. Because I think there's a couple things that anarchy, noble idea that it is, a purely contractual system of governance that everyone opts into their own governing arrangements. There's a few big problems I don't think it would solve very well. So the first one is how would you deal with aggression in a unprivatizable commons where everyone is aggressing against each other a little bit all the time? That's kind of a wonky way of saying it, but a good example of this would be something like air pollution, right? So somebody drives their car down the street in front of the hotel here, they're emitting harmful pollutants. I breathe that in, I didn't consent to that, I'm harmed slightly by it. And so the question is, how would Ancapistan deal with that? I guess I would have to sue the individual driver for redress of grievances, but then of course there's thousands of cars in the city emitting air pollution, so I guess I would have to sue thousands of drivers, and meanwhile I might be a driver myself. And so while I'm suing thousands of people, I'm also a defendant in thousands of lawsuits. Doesn't seem like the most workable system. Maybe you would say, as an anarchist, it's like, hey, you know what, air pollution, that's just part of the game. We're not gonna, you know, you just kind of have to put up with that as part of being in society. But that's kind of a concession, too, that here's this element of aggression that we don't really have a good system to deal with. The other thing that I think system of voluntary contractual government that it wouldn't deal very well with is the fact that contracts can have this kind of pernicious way of binding people in the present to the will of people in the past in a way that they didn't necessarily consciously consent to. And I'm going to give kind of an inflammatory example, but I think it's a really important one.
The Constitution.
Oh, sorry, that was my turn. Sorry, that was my turn. Sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, wait till I get to it. Something like racial covenants, right? So maybe if we have some property owners in the room, you can look at deeds today, and on there'll be these provisions that say, A, this home is not to be sold to someone who's not white. B, if you ever, you know, anyone who you do sell this home to has to also agree to this condition. So what you've done is establish by contract, basically, in perpetuity, racial segregation. Now, in the 1940s, the Supreme Court ruled this provision of these racial covenants basically unenforceable by courts, right? I think that's a better world to live in than one in which, you know, a contract signed by two racists 100 years ago binds the will of people today in a way that they find suboptimal, they don't like. And then the last thing that I think anarchy doesn't deal with very well is what do you do with people who can't reasonably sign contracts? So primarily in mind, I'm thinking of children. You know, how do you deal with the issue of child protection in an anarchist world? And maybe the answer would be that parents, communities have total say over their children, and I think that wouldn't be disastrous, but it's still, I'm not sure exactly how that system would deal with issues of, you know, child abuse, child protection when that comes up. Murray Rothbard had this interesting idea of like a free market in babies, where basically abusive or neglectful parents could fetch a market price for their child by selling it to a loving home. And like, all right, that's a great idea, Murray. I don't know how well that would work in practice. So those are like the three big issues that I see anarchy not quite solving. But I'm interested to hear why Spike thinks the pedophiles and the racists should run society.
So I
it away,
also am
Spike.
not going to defend the status quo, which is what we have right now. Pedophiles and racists running society. But thank you for that. I want to, and that completely non-leading question. So taking a step back, my belief of why I'm an anarchist is because I'm a libertarian. I believe in people's self-ownership. I believe in people's autonomy. I believe that any attempt to aggress against the autonomy, self-ownership, and property of others is inherently not just morally wrong. You know, you don't hurt people, you don't take their stuff, but it also doesn't work well. It's not a good way of arranging how to distribute resources, and it's not a great way for human beings to organize each other. I'm an anarchist because I don't believe that there is an asterisk next to that says that if you build a marble building and appoint yourself or get enough people to vote for you to have an official title and then write on a sheet of paper that you've authorized yourself in perpetuity to do this, that you suddenly can do all those acts of aggression, that they suddenly become a good thing. That's essentially why I'm an anarchist. I also am not defending the status quo, which incidentally is why I'm not a minarchist. So if you think, the American tradition was we overthrew the monarchy and we introduced the Articles of Confederation, which was an attempt at creating what Christians said, a very, very limited government that had very few coercive powers, that really only existed to maintain a status of protection of people's rights and lives and property, and really just a basic level of governance to have a civil society. It was immediately replaced in an act of retro-legalized treason to create the Constitution, which was ostensibly an attempt to create a minarchistic style of government, and it eventually turned into what we have now. So it is the status quo. Our status quo was born of a legitimate attempt at minarchy, replaced with, I would argue, a fake attempt at minarchy. But it all started with a legitimate attempt at minarchy. So I believe that an anarchist society doesn't necessarily mean that there is no governance and no rules. It means that governance is happening locally. It is happening from the stakeholders involved in a given area or situation or commons, and that the mechanism for funding for that thing is voluntary and not coercive, and that people who are not directly involved in that stake are therefore able to opt out of it and are not bound to it. Going to one of the questions that Christian asked about the idea of creating a document, a contract, and then saying that everyone in that property or bound to that agreement are bound to it in perpetuity even after the original people that signed it died. Well, that's what a government charter is, except instead of it being on that individual property or that commons, it's on, in this case, the entire landmass of the United States of America, and as that landmass was expanded by that government, so too was the presumed authority and jurisdiction that everyone was bound to under that contract. So it is that thing of binding people under a contract that very few people agreed to at the time that it was written, and no one that is alive today agreed to now. So to answer your question, so for example, the question of how to deal with pollution. So from a property rights standpoint and a private law standpoint, there is an element of what's called proportionality that gets lost in all of the memes about Ancapistan. So I think we've probably all seen the meme where it's a yellow and black ball with a thumbs up, and it'll say something like, when your neighbor's ankle brushes against the grain, a blade of grass on your property, and so you nuke his home with tactical McNukes trademark, which, by the way, that's a government thing. But anyway, with tactical McNukes, and then enslave his children in perpetuity because he violated your property rights. And it's got the ANCAP ball, That's not proportional, right? So the reality is, yes, theoretically, if someone walks by and their ankle brushes on your grass, then yes, they have violated your property. And they should be punished to the proportionality of what they did, which is nothing, because they didn't actually even hurt that blade of grass, much less in any other demonstrable way cause any harm to you. If their foot stepped on your property, again, nothing actually happened. If they climbed over your fence, stood on this side of the property, and then climbed back and got back on whatever the common walkway was, the punishment would be something like, hey, don't do that again, because again, no damage was actually done. So applying the concept of proportionality to something like, for example, pollution answers that question as well, right? So if I am driving by in my car and whatever level of pollution my hybrid, I know I've just lost some of you, but whatever level of pollution my hybrid causes, there's no demonstrable harm that was done there. So no, you can't sue me, nor can I sue you for the fact that you're burning wood in your fireplace or something like that. Now, if you have someone, an individual or a firm, a company, whatever, who is doing actual demonstrable pollution to the local and regional environment, they're dumping in a common waterway, or they're causing pollution to get into the groundwater or something like that, well, now that's something that is actually demonstrable. There's actual harm that can be demonstrated, in many cases enumerated, and that can be dealt with. Protecting children, again, I think we could go a long way by not being ruled over by pedophiles and their protectors. I think that would be a great step in the right direction. But I also think that, again, in any society, there are still going to be standards and rules, right? Like, for example, not just protecting children, but protecting lives. Like, you can't murder people. And not everyone's going to abide by that. They're not going to say, wow, I live in an anarchist society of non-aggression, and I know deep down morally that I could never commit murder, and therefore I shall not. That's not going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. So there are still going to have to be a level of rules that are, to an extent, coercive, to the extent that they say, you cannot hurt this person, and if you do, you will be punished by the standards of how our community does that. So there will always be governance. There will always be hierarchy, but it is a voluntary one, and the most key point of it is that by allowing people to opt out, it is a form of voluntary free market governance. The last point I want to make, there was a third one there. I think did I cover all that? So I think the last point I want to take is there is no utopia. Anyone who tries to tell you that their system is going to do away with poverty or do away with violence or do away with pollution or whatever else, they are telling you that they have magically found a way to suspend the human nature of self-interest and the universal nature of entropy. And there is no such thing. That's not real. That's not, they're either lying or they're naive or both, some combination of those. So I'm certainly not selling you on a utopia. And I'm not even 100% certain. In the same way that we've never had a sustainable minarchy, I don't know that we'll ever have a sustainable anarchy. What I do know is that my North Star, the thing that I am guided by, is getting as, and we probably agree on this, as uncoercive, as voluntary, and as free market of a society as humanly possible, whatever that looks like. And if your exit is minarchy and mine is at the guardrails and going off the cliff with anarchy, then you can join me there. But the closer we get to the ideal of as little all the way to possibly no coercion as possible, the better we are. But we should not try to sell ourselves on sustainable utopia ideas.
Yeah, I assume there's probably broad agreement among us and in the room that, yeah, directionally we have to move. I mean, we're having this academic fight because we're all like-minded and it's fun, but...
And we're libertarians and like to argue.
Right, major consensus that we're so far to go, we're not going to have any fight over, oh, well, now the state's gotten too small. How would you respond to some of the things Spike said, Christian?
Yes, so a couple things I'd like to respond to. So firstly, your point about proportionality, it's a good one, but it still doesn't address this problem where, you know, an individual's harm done to you is minor, and so you wouldn't really have much of a redress of grievances. Again, the car driving down the road, right? But in the aggregate, everyone doing that actually does create a serious externality, and as a result, a serious act of aggression. So that would be just air pollution writ large. large. Smog I think air pollution causes something like 100,000 premature deaths in the United States each year. It used to be a lot more, but then we passed the Clean Air Act. And so I think that the idea that you could have some sort of set regulatory standard that balances those two interests between letting people, live their lives and engage in economic activity, but then also protecting their health, that's, acting to prevent aggression, and it does it more efficiently than I'm not sure how anarchists would handle that. And then the second one about the Articles of Confederation point, I think it's convincing when you're just taking a snapshot of history, right? Where it's like, okay, here was a small government, and then it became a large government, so obviously minarchy is going to fail, right? But I mean, if you expand the parameters a little bit, it's like, well, we used to not have states at all, and then we had monarchies, and then we shrank the government and got the Articles of Confederation. So like, change on the margins is possible, and I think it's more realistic too. Like you mentioned, we're not utopians, we're trying to find something that's realistic. And so what's more realistic, that we have the big government we have today, and we shrink it down to a minimal size, or that we abolish the concept of statism altogether? Friedrich Hayek in The Constitution of Liberty, it's interesting, he talks about how he lumps the anarchists in with the socialists and the Jacobins, where it's like, these are people who, they sit down and they think they can reason out all the rules of society. And he was critical of that. Instead, he was much more indebted to British liberal philosophers who grew up in a system of liberty and were like, okay, how do we understand this? How do we understand the spontaneous order that gave us this very fragile civilization? And part of that spontaneous order that bubbled up with liberty was minimal government, and so that's why he came down on the side of minarchy. Yeah, I think those were the two things I wanted to respond to. Yeah.
And to add to that, do you think at some point, if we have, because you talked about proportionality and you can't just nuke someone for touching a blade of grass on your property, but then
you shouldn't.
Right. But then the judging of the proportionality. We're having disputes adjudicated, I assume, by kind of private systems of courts and lawmaking, tort-type system, which actually has worked very well historically, and was the good laws we have are just products of what came naturally out of torts.
Most of them, yeah.
Yes. But do you think that, over time, like a series of a regime of overlapping private judge-made law that I think would be good and would work, will just at some, I think you might argue this, would at some level just resemble a kind of minarchy? Do you know what I mean?
And this is where the whole, self-interest and entropy coming together thing can happen. Any system can devolve into the status quo, or even something worse than it. I mean, how many times have we seen brutal dictatorships be ended in a glorious workers' revolution, only to be replaced with something in many ways worse than what it replaced? So yeah, that absolutely could happen. It could only happen by people saying this anarchism is, instead of this anarchism, we're going to do what many others have done and cry out for the proverbial king. We're going to say, actually, look at what we're able to do with this voluntary society, but imagine if we could make those idiots do what we want them to do instead, because we're so much smarter than them. And that would eventually lead to maybe either some kind of form of minarchy, or even skipping minarchy and going straight into some kind of straight-out unrepentant and intentioned tyranny. But that's not necessarily a damnation of anarchy. That's a damnation of those who would look at a system of non-coercion and try to change it. And that's present in any system. In a system that could equally be a condemnation of minarchy. Could a minarchist government, and we already know the answer to this, could a minarchist government turn into a tyrannical one that does immeasurable harm here and around the world? Yes, we live in it. That is what we have right now. So yes. One question I'd actually like to pose to you is the idea, and this almost feels unfair because it's similar to me, people saying to me, well, in an anarchist system, how would you stop the tyranny? But I guess all's fair play. In a minarchist system, so we know the attempt to enshrine in both the Articles of Confederation and at least ostensibly in the Constitution a Bill of Rights, do not pass, basically a no tyranny zone sign, saying that this is not going to be allowed, the government cannot do that, and then watching, for example, one of Washington's first acts to seize everyone's guns in the run-up to the Whiskey Rebellion. What would you propose in a minarchy, in your Mincapistan, in whatever you call your society, to prevent that from happening, to actually force the Chia pet not to continue growing?
Don't tax tax whiskey, right?
Agreed there, yes.
All right, that's something we can all agree on too. No, so I mean, the problem is you're never going to escape politics, right? So the first thing I would say in favor of the Constitution, has it constrained the Leviathan state completely? No, it hasn't, but it actually does a pretty good job when it's pretty explicit, right? I think we in America don't realize sometimes how well protected our speech is, even compared to other liberal societies. You know, places like the United Kingdom have really insane libel laws where it's like you can be sued unless you can prove what you said was true. You would have to pay damages. In Australia, they have really strict privacy laws, so like journalists have been forbidden from reporting on like politicians' families because this is criminalized there. I'm getting maybe some of the details
You can
wrong.
get arrested in the UK for posting
Rap lyrics.
offensive rap lyrics
Yeah.
on Facebook. You can be ticketed in the UK.
Right.
Someone just got arrested. A lady got arrested because of an allegation that she owned the anonymous account on some website that said insulting things about someone, and they had no proof.
Right. So absurd, right? The United States, those things mercifully, at least when it comes to the regulation of speech, don't, you know, those kind of absurd cases don't happen because we're pretty explicit about those protections. So having more explicit protections, I think, does a pretty good job. But yeah, I mean, how do you prevent a tyranny from arising? It's by doing all the things that people in this room do every day, right? Is you advocate for the ideas of liberty, you advocate for what you think a positive vision of government looks like, and you try to, you know, adopt that by convincing other people consensually, by working through democratic politics. And, you know, again, on the margins, there's libertarian success stories all over the place. You know, places have legalized marijuana. We're, you know, making progress on allowing, you know, my beat is, you know, housing zoning stuff. And we're making progress on that issue too. Criminal justice reform is something that's happening. Again, this isn't overthrowing the Leviathan state, but my point is that how do you prevent tyranny? It's, you know, like all good Austrians, we work on the margins, so.
And I agree on that point. I mean, most people here probably have heard of the Rothbard button. Murray Rothbard proposed a button that if you could press it, it would make all violent monopolies, all states go away, and you can't call yourself a true abolitionist unless you would smash that button until it broke. Well, the thing is, there is no Rothbard button. And if there was one, if I did press it, which I would, if I could press that button, probably pretty quickly, everyone would turn around, look at me, and go, what the hell did you just do? And they go back to creating a government which would likely be worse than the one it replaced. So obviously we have to work in increments. Obviously we have to work on the I'm not sure I don't like saying on the margins because it just sounds so like dilute, but
Or marginalized, right?
Yeah. Well, it just sounds like we're doing almost like, you know, we're rearranging deck chairs or something. But obviously we have to work in increments, large or small. So it has to be a directional thing. We're not going to go from today to, even in some relative short period of time, to what either of us want. I mean, if I could press a button to create what Christian wants, I would do so. But that's not real. So we likely will be largely agreeing on that path until we get to government, and then I have to convince Christian that we can get rid of these departments too. But yeah, I mean, and your answer is 100% correct. We have to remain vigilant. We have to always be working to keep back that sort of almost natural growth of human beings to want to create, centralize, and then leverage that power for themselves and against those they don't like. But that's true of anarchy as well, right? Like any system is going to require us to have anything close to what we're resembling or ever even get near to it to ever be vigilant for those things. So that's actually why I brought it up, is because that's something we both share in common. If we cannot propose a utopia because A, it's not real, and B, even if it was, it's not sustainable without us always being vigilant to make sure. I believe it was ironically one of our worst spending presidents ever, Ronald Reagan, who said that freedom is always one generation away from extinction. So I would say the same thing here. We have to remain vigilant, whether you're an anarchist, minarchist, I don't know, some other thing or whatever. You have to remain vigilant in maintaining that.
Closing thought, Christian?
No, I mean, I think that pretty well covered it. I guess the one thing I would say is, you know, we're both working towards a similar end. Again, there are just these. Once we get closer and closer to Ancapistan, it's like there's what do you call it? Diminishing marginal returns to getting rid of government. So you know, it's easy. We can get rid of HUD and the Defense Department. You know, no one's arguing about that.
TSA.
Okay, TSA,
TSA.
right?
ATF.
We're all about to go experience that
Federal
again
Reserve.
tomorrow.
You can't not press the button if pressing the button means no more TSA.
Yeah, if the button is 3.4 ounces or below, you can press it. But there's diminishing marginal returns to reducing government. And again, I would just reiterate, there are just a couple of these kind of technical, but I still think fundamental problems that I don't see Anarchy quite addressing. But yeah, we are moving in the same direction, or we'd like to see society move in the same direction. So yeah, let's end on a note of agreement then.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming here to watch Christian destroy me with facts and logic, a fusillade, if you will, of truth bombs. And like you said, it would be the minarchist who would drop bombs. So, yeah, I mean, yes, there are.
I think we have time for like 90 seconds worth of questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, can I just ask about the racial covenants that
Yeah.
Who has tort claim in that situation?
It would be the neighbors. Yeah, because it's like a externality, I guess, on their property.
So we have a situation with the these NDAs, right, that are increasingly not being enforced because of social pressure. I feel like that would probably be a similar solution to that.
Yeah, so that would be a good argument, which is that if you, the longer a provision of a contract doesn't go enforced, then you know, it becomes unenforceable under like common law. I guess, you know, potentially we could get to that situation, but again, it would maybe create a complex litigation. You'd have to try and figure out like whether this was enforced or not. They like, you know, 3 parties back tried to sell to a non-white buyer and then they weren't allowed to because someone tried to enforce it. I think that would be kind of difficult to do. Better yet to just declare that we're not going to enforce these contracts anymore.
In a contract that was signed by a bunch of dead people that a good number of the parties no longer want to be a part of is null and void and unenforceable unless there is an enforcement mechanism whose job it is to make you follow it. That, in my mind, is actually an argument for anarchy, is that there would be less of that. There would be more of people going, well, none of us agree to this, and I don't like it, and we're opting out. So, yeah. Any other questions?
One last question, yeah. Or, oh, well, you guys have to fight. Okay.
How long is it conceptually possible, or how long would you say it's the conception of Ancapistan? How long do you think it would take to implement?
Oh, I have absolutely no idea, nor do I have any idea of how long it would be sustainable. That's really up to you.
One more.
You
one
are
more.
the power.
My argument on anarchism, how would you address tyranny that exists outside of the state and in a private matter? A great example would be cults, where like Scientology, the Jim Jones cult, the anarchists, we have a cult leader who's manipulating followers to be part of this tyrannical control. And cults are somewhat voluntary, but through manipulation and grooming of people.
Yeah.
How would you address the Ayn Rand cult? Yeah.
Whoa.
Sorry, I realize I'm losing all the friends in the room.
Well, the way that I will deal with the cult of American jingoism. No. So, honestly, in the society we have right now, because the cults are largely voluntary, at least initially, there's not much that can be done about it. If someone wants to join a cult and that cult at that moment isn't harming anyone else, there's not a lot you can do. Scientology or even some of these smaller ones, there's not much that can be done until and unless they actually start harming others or there's demonstration that they're harming people within it. Within any kind of civil society that any of us want, minarchists, anarchists, whatever else, there are going to be certain mores that are going to be kept. One of those is you cannot hurt others. And whether that is a cult that decides to weaponize and start attacking its neighbors to expand its property under some crazy idea like manifest destiny, or whether we're talking about a cult that starts, you know, harming the children in it or harming the adults in it or hurting them or something else, if there's demonstrable harm that's being done, then there is a legitimate right to use whatever level of coercion or force is necessary in the defense of self and others to stop that. Anarchism, minarchism, the current status quo, that's the case in all of them.
Yeah, yeah. All right, thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.